There is a kind of goodness that is born when all else seems lost, a flame that arises just when the world is colder and merciless. Here, in the barren heart of this lawless land, few men still carry that spark. Most have learned that compassion is a dangerous luxury that can cost more than you are willing to pay. Thomas Whitmore had learned this lesson the hard way. His farm stretched across the dry valleys of Arizona, where the sun lashed the land with relentless fury, and where every drop of water was worth more than gold. A man with calloused hands and a face marked by time, he knew every stone, every thorny bush on his property. He also knew the weight of the choices that a man must make when civilization has not yet arrived, and the only law is the one that each one carries in his chest. Night had fallen like a black cloak over the plain when Thomas saw the staggering figure approach his property. The night wind brought the smell of death and despair, mixed with the dry aroma of mugwort. His hands instinctively reached for the rifle resting on the balcony, but something about the way the stranger moved, slowly, heavily, as one who carries the world on his shoulders, made him hesitate. The man approaching was a native. His tanned skin was stained with dried blood, and he limped visibly, leaning on a broken spear. His traditional clothes were torn, and Thomas could see deep wounds on his chest and left arm. He was a warrior, that was clear, but now he was nothing more than a wounded man, looking for a place to die with dignity. Thomas stood motionless on the porch, the rifle still in his hands. He knew well the stories that ran through the region. He knew about the recent attacks, the burned farms, the entire families who had disappeared in the middle of the night. He also knew that showing mercy to a wounded enemy could be interpreted as weakness, or worse, as betrayal of one's own race. But when the native fell to his knees a few yards from his house, when his eyes lifted up in silent supplication, Thomas saw something which he recognized at once. It was not the look of an enemy. It was the look of a desperate father, of a man who had lost everything, and who now begged only for a dignified death. The farmer walked down the steps slowly, still holding the gun. The native made no mention of defending himself. His strength was almost exhausted, and he knew that his journey had come to an end. With weak gestures, he pointed to his own throat, and then to the fire that Thomas had lit earlier to ward off the cold of the night. Water. The man was asking for water. Thomas looked around, as if waiting for someone to emerge from the shadows to witness his decision. The plain remained empty and silent, only the wind whispering among the cacti. There were no neighbors for miles, no authority to judge his actions. There was only one dying man and another who had to decide what kind of person he really was. He put his rifle against the wall and walked to the well. He filled a canteen with fresh water and returned to where the native had collapsed completely to the ground. He knelt beside the wounded man and raised his head carefully, bringing the canteen to his parched lips. The native drank greedily, and Thomas could see tears forming at the corners of his eyes. They were not tears of physical pain, but tears of gratitude, of relief for having found in his last moments a fragment of humanity in a world that had proved so cruel. Thomas helped the man sit more comfortably, leaning him against a rock by the fire. The heat of the flames seemed to revive a little life in the native's eyes. He murmured something in his tongue, words that Thomas did not understand, but whose meaning was universal. Gratitude, recognition, maybe even forgiveness. The farmer brought a few pieces of dried meat and more water. I knew I was probably making a mistake. He knew that helping an enemy warrior could have dire consequences. But something deep inside him, a voice he had been trying to silence for years, told him that this was the right thing to do. All night long, Thomas remained awake, watching the native who slept restlessly by the fire. Sometimes the wounded man was delirious, muttering names that only he knew. Other times their eyes would open and meet Thomas's, and there was a quiet communication between them, an understanding that transcended differences in language and culture. When the first ray of sunlight cut the horizon, Thomas realized that something had changed. The air was different, charged with a tension that he could not identify. The native had also noticed. His eyes, once calm, now showed a mixture of panic and grief. With great effort, the wounded man rose to his feet and pointed to the horizon. Thomas followed the direction of his finger and felt the blood run cold in his veins. All along the fence that bounded his property, silent figures had appeared like ghosts in the golden morning light. Warriors, dozens of them, maybe 100, all mounted, all armed, all looking directly at the house where his wounded brother had found refuge during the night. The silence that precedes the storm has a weight of its own. It descends upon men like a tombstone, crushing all hope, all illusion, that tomorrow can still exist. Thomas knew this silence well. There was meaning before every battle in the war, before every decision that would change the course of his life forever. The warriors stood motionless like bronze statues against the brightening sky. His spears cut through the morning air in perfect lines, and his horses seemed to grasp the gravity of the moment, keeping quiet as if they were also waiting for an invisible signal. Thomas was able to count at least 90 men, perhaps more, scattered throughout his estate in a formation that left no escape. The wounded native next to him tried to get up, but his legs weakened, and he collapsed again next to the fire that was still crackling. His eyes met Thomas's, and in them there was a deep sadness, as if he understood that his presence there had sealed the fate of the white man who had offered him shelter. Thomas felt his hand shake slightly as he held the rifle. He knew that the weapon would be useless against so many warriors, but it was all he had. 90 bullets would not be enough, even if each shot found its target. And Thomas Whitmore was not the kind of man who deluded himself with heroic fantasies. The morning wind brought with it the muffled sound of hooves against the dry land. One of the warriors had detached himself from the group and was slowly riding towards the house. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man with his face painted with symbols that Thomas could not decipher. Their clothes were more elaborate than those of the others, indicating high position within the tribe. Thomas stepped forward, placing himself between the approaching warrior and the wounded man by the fire. He didn't know if this gesture would be interpreted as protection or defiance, but something inside him said he couldn't back down now. He had made a decision the night before, and now he had to bear the consequences. The warrior stopped about 10 meters from the balcony. His eyes scanned the scene, the campfire still burning, the empty canteen next to the injured man, the scraps of food Thomas had shared during the night. His expression was indecipherable, but Thomas could see that he was evaluating every detail, trying to understand exactly what had happened there. The wounded man muttered something in his native tongue, weak but urgent words. The mounted warrior tilted his head, paying attention to each syllable. His expression changed subtly, and Thomas realized that he was being described what had happened during the night. Shared water, the food offered, the silent vigil by the fire. Minutes passed in absolute silence. The sun rose slowly over the horizon, painting the sky with orange and golden tones. The other warriors remained motionless in their positions, as if they were part of the arid landscape itself. Thomas could hear only his own breath and the crackling of the embers dying in the fire. The leader of the warriors descended from his horse with fluid, deliberate movements. He was even more imposing on his feet, and Thomas could see the scars that marked his arms and chest, witnesses to countless battles. He walked to where the wounded man was lying and knelt beside him. Their conversation was brief, conducted in low tones that Thomas could not hear clearly, but he could hear the emotion in the wounded man's voice, the way his eyes were repeatedly directed to the farmer who had offered him refuge. There was gratitude there, but also supplication. He was begging for something. When the conversation was over, the leader slowly rose and walked to where Thomas was waiting. He stopped a few feet from him, and for a long moment, the two men studied each other. Thomas saw in the warrior's eyes a keen intelligence, a wisdom that had come from years of commanding men in battle, but he also saw something else, a genuine surprise, as if he had found something he did not expect. The warrior raised his right hand, showing his empty palm. Thomas understood the gesture and slowly lowered his rifle, leaning it against the wall of the house. It was an act of faith, of mutual trust that could cost her life. But he knew that any other gesture would be interpreted as hostility. The leader then spoke, in broken but understandable English. His voice was deep, loaded with authority, but there was no anger in it, just a deep curiosity and something Thomas couldn't fully identify. He explained in carefully chosen words that the injured man was his younger brother, that he had left on a reconnaissance mission and had not returned when he should have been, that they had followed his trail there, hoping to find only another body to bury with honor, but instead they had found something different. They had met a white man who had risked his own life to offer comfort to a wounded enemy, someone who will share his fire, his water, his food, without asking for anything in return, without even knowing if he would be matched or killed at dawn. The warrior stopped talking and looked Thomas straight in the eye. There was an unasked question in the air, a genuine curiosity about the reasons that led the farmer to act as he had done. Thomas realized that his response, or lack thereof, would determine not only his own fate, but perhaps the fate of all the settlers in the region. There are times in a man's life when words become useless, When everything that has been lived, everything that has been learned, comes down to a single look, a silent gesture that carries the weight of an entire existence. Thomas Whitmore knew he was living in one of those moments. The warrior leader was waiting for an answer that might not be given with words. His dark eyes studied every line of the farmer's aged face, looking for signs of lying or weakness. Around them, the other warriors stood motionless, but Thomas could feel the tension grow like steam in the morning air. Thomas looked at the wounded man by the almost extinguished fire. The native had managed to sit down with some effort and watched the scene with a mixture of hope and resignation. His wounds were still bleeding slowly, dyeing the makeshift bandages Thomas had made overnight from pieces of his own shirt red. How to explain to a man who had spent his entire life at war that there are times when humanity simply overcomes fear? How can we describe the inner voice that whispers that doing what is right matters more than doing what is safe? Thomas raised his eyes to the horizon, where the sun was already beginning to punish the earth with its relentless heat. His hands, calloused from years of hard work, trembled slightly, not of fear, but of contained emotion. He remembered his wife, who had died 3 years earlier of a fever. He remembered the words she used to repeat, that every man carries within himself a divine spark, and that to extinguish this spark in another human being was the same as to extinguish it in oneself. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse but firm. He explained that he had seen only one injured man looking for water, that it didn't matter what color his skin was or what language he spoke, that his wife had taught him that compassion was not a luxury, but a necessity, that a man who loses the ability to help another in need loses his own humanity as well. The warrior leader listened in silence, his expression remaining indecipherable. When Thomas finished speaking, a long silence settled between them. The wind had stopped completely, as if nature itself awaited the outcome of this unlikely encounter. The injured man mumbled something to his brother, words charged with urgency. The leader nodded slowly, as if he were making a difficult decision. He walked to his mount and pulled something out of one of the leather bags that hung from the saddle. It was a necklace made of colored beads and small bones, clearly an object of great symbolic value. He returned to where Thomas was waiting and held out the necklace towards him. His voice, when he spoke, was charged with an emotion that he was trying to control. He explained that the necklace had belonged to their father, a great chief who had died defending his tribe years before, that it was a tradition among his people to offer it only to warriors who showed true courage and honor. Thomas hesitated to accept the gift. He understood the symbolic weight of that gesture, but he did not feel worthy of such an honor. He had done only what any decent person should do. He did not seek rewards or recognition for an act he considered natural, but the warrior leader insisted, putting the necklace in the farmer's hands. His eyes met Thomas's, and in them there was a depth that spoke of mutual respect, of an understanding that transcended the cultural barriers that separated them. What happened next surprised everyone. The leader turned to his warriors and made a gesture with his right hand. Immediately all the men dismounted and knelt, touching their foreheads to the barren ground in a gesture of deep respect. It was an honor rarely bestowed, even on members of the tribe itself. Thomas watched the scene with a mixture of wonder and discomfort. He had never asked for recognition for his actions, and seeing those proud men paying obeisance left him deeply touched. He realized that he had witnessed something rare, the moment when enemies recognize in the other a nobility that goes beyond the circumstances that put them on opposite sides. The warrior leader then explained that his tribe was leaving those lands, who had understood that war would only bring more suffering to all involved, that men like Thomas proved that it was possible to find bridges of understanding even in the darkest moments. But there was something more to his words, a deep sadness that Thomas recognized immediately. It was the sadness of a man who knew that not all of his people would agree with that decision, that there were other tribes, other leaders, who would see any gesture of peace as a sign of weakness. The wounded man managed to get up with the help of 2 warriors. His legs were still shaking, but there was determination in his eyes. He walked slowly over to Thomas and placed his hand on the farmer's heart. His words were few, but Thomas understood their meaning. He had created a brother where before there was only one enemy. When the warriors mounted their horses again, the leader approached Thomas one last time. His voice was charged with urgency as he explained that other war groups were still roaming the region, that not everyone was as willing to dialogue as he was, that Thomas should be careful, as his kindness could be seen by others as a betrayal of his own race. It was a warning born of genuine concern, of respect for a man who had proven his worth in the most unexpected way possible. A wise man's prophecy carries the weight of the storm that has not yet come. Thomas watched the warriors move away on the horizon until they became just dark dots against the blue sky. But the leader's words of warning echoed in his mind like funeral bells. There were other tribes, other men who did not share the same vision of honor and compassion. The days that followed brought a deceptive tranquility. Thomas resumed his routine of tending cattle and repairing fences, but now he always carried the collar he had been given under his shirt, not out of superstition, but as a reminder that there are possible bridges between seemingly irreconcilable worlds. His hands touched the colored beads whenever loneliness weighed too heavily on his shoulders. On the third night after the encounter, Thomas was awakened by the sound that every frontier farmer learns to fear, the sound of hooves galloping in the darkness, accompanied by war cries that cut through the air like blades. But these were different from the sounds he had heard days before. There was anger in these screams, a thirst for revenge that made the blood run cold in my veins. He jumped out of bed and ran to the window. In the light of the full moon, he could see at least 20 warriors surrounding his property. But these did not come in organized training like the previous ones. They rode in tight circles, shouting words that Thomas did not understand, but whose meaning was clear. They had come to kill. Thomas took out his rifle and checked the ammunition. 20 bullets against 20 men. The odds weren't good, but he wasn't the kind of man who gave up without a fight. He had built that farm with his own hands. He had buried his wife in the small cemetery at the back of the property. That land was his life, and he would defend it until his last breath. The attackers set fire to the stables first. The flames rose against the night sky like orange fingers, and Thomas could hear the desperate mooing of his cattle trying to escape. Decades of hard work were being consumed by the flames in a matter of minutes. One of the warriors detached himself from the group and rode close to the house, shouting something in his native language. Thomas didn't understand the words, but he could hear the fury in his voice. It was an accusation, a condemnation. Apparently, the news of his compassion for the wounded warrior had spread, but it had been interpreted very differently. Thomas then understood the true extent of his situation. To these men, he was not a farmer who had shown mercy to a wounded enemy. He was a traitor, a white man who had chosen the wrong side in the conflict that devastated the region. His kindness had been turned into a crime in the eyes of those who saw the world only in black and white. The first arrows began to fly, digging into the wood of the walls with dry sounds. Thomas responded with well-aimed shots, knocking 2 attackers off their mounts. But I knew it was a losing battle. For every man he slaughtered, it seemed that 2 others took his place. It was then that he heard something that made his heart race. Sounds of hooves approaching quickly, coming from the opposite direction. For a moment he thought that more enemies had arrived to join the attack. He prepared to sell his life dearly, determined not to die a coward. But the newcomers did not join the attackers. Instead, Thomas heard screams of surprise and confusion. Through the smoke that began to invade his house, he could see mounted figures engaging the attackers in direct combat. There was a battle going on in his backyard, but he couldn't distinguish who was fighting whom. An arrow went through the window and stuck itself in the wall a few inches from his head. Thomas bent down and crawled to another position, trying to get a better view of what was happening outside. What he saw left him speechless. The warrior leader who had left days before was back, fighting fiercely against the attackers. His men had formed a defensive semicircle around Thomas's house, using their spears and battle axes with deadly skill. It was a battle between brothers, a miniature civil war being fought on their property. Thomas realized that he had unwittingly become the center of something much greater than a simple act of compassion. His decision to help a wounded man had exposed a deep divide within the region's tribes. On the one hand, those who believed that honor and respect could transcend racial differences. On the other, those who saw any gesture of peace as a betrayal of dead ancestors. The battle lasted until dawn. When the last attacker was knocked down or fled wounded, Thomas left his home to find a scene of devastation. His stables were but smoldering ashes, several fences had been torn down, and the bodies of warriors on both sides were strewn across his property. The leader who had returned to defend him was wounded. An enemy spear had pierced his left shoulder, but still he stood tall, proud, looking into Thomas's eyes with an expression that mixed sadness and determination. His words were few, but loaded with deep meaning. He explained that he could not allow a man of honor to die for showing compassion. that some values transcend tribal differences, that Thomas's kindness had planted a seed that some were determined to nurture, while others wanted to trample it before it could grow. Thomas understood that his life had changed forever. It was no longer just a farmer trying to survive on the frontier. It had become unintentionally a symbol of something bigger, a reminder that even in the darkest moments of human history, compassion can still find a way. The ashes were still smoking when the first white man rode down the dusty trail. It was the sheriff of the nearest town, a hard-faced man who had seen his share of violence at the border. He was accompanied by 3 deputies, all armed, all expecting to find only another farmer dead, and his property reduced to rubble. What they found was Thomas Whitmore alive, healing the wounds of native warriors on his porch. The scene defied all logic they knew about the war that ravaged the region. Whites and natives working side by side, sharing water and improvised medicines, treating each other with mutual respect. The sheriff slowly dismounted, his hand hovering over the butt of his revolver. His eyes scanned the surrounding destruction, the burned stables, the torn fences, the bodies strewn across the yard. But he also saw something that confused him. Native warriors helping to rebuild what had been destroyed, lifting wood, carrying stones. Thomas approached the sheriff with tired steps. His clothes were stained with blood and soot, his face scarred with smoke and exhaustion. But his eyes maintained a clarity that impressed the lawman. There was no defeat in them, no bitterness. There was something the sheriff was slow to recognize: hope. The story Thomas told that day would spread across the border in the weeks to come. It spoke of a simple act of compassion that had grown into something much greater, of how sharing water with a wounded stranger had created bonds stronger than decades of conflict, of how kindness, even when it was costly, could still plant seeds of change. The warrior leader, his arm bandaged but still imposing, approached the sheriff. His words were carefully chosen, delivered in English that he had learned from years of failed negotiations. He explained that some of his people were tired of the war, that they had seen in Thomas's gesture a possible bridge to a different future. It wouldn't be easy. There were many, on both sides, who preferred the brutal simplicity of conflict to the complexity of coexistence. But something had changed on that devastated property. A seed had been planted, watered with blood and tears, but still alive. In the weeks that followed, other farmers began to arrive. Some came out of curiosity, others out of skepticism. They wanted to see with their own eyes the man who had survived an attack by helping the enemy. They wanted to understand how anyone could keep faith in humanity when everything around them seemed to conspire against it. Thomas received them all with the same simplicity with which he had received the wounded warrior that first night. He offered water to the thirsty, food to the hungry, shelter to the needy. He did not preach about compassion or forgiveness. He simply lived these values day after day, act by act. The farm was rebuilt, but now it was different. There was a small reserved area where natives and settlers could meet to exchange goods and information. It wasn't much, but it was a start. A proof that walls can be torn down, even the oldest and seemingly insurmountable ones. The necklace Thomas had received never left his neck, not as a trophy or symbol of achievement, but as a reminder that every choice matters. That one man can make a difference even when the odds seem impossible, especially then. There were other attacks, other attempts to destroy what was being built. But now Thomas was no longer alone. There were settlers willing to defend a new way of living, natives determined to prove that peace was possible. Not a crowd, but enough to make a difference. The wounded man who had appeared that first night became a frequent visitor to the farm. His wounds had healed, leaving scars that he carried as badges of honor, not because they marked his survival, but because they remembered the moment when he found goodness where he expected only death. As the months passed, the story became a legend, told around campfires, whispered in halls, repeated in Sunday sermons. Some exaggerated it, turning Thomas into a larger-than-life hero. Others distorted it, trying to find hidden motivations for their actions. But Thomas knew the truth. He knew that it was not heroism that had led him to help a wounded stranger. It had simply been humanity, the refusal to let fear and hatred extinguish the spark of compassion that his wife had helped ignite in his heart. When winter came, bringing with it the biting cold that the region knew well, Thomas found himself sitting on the same porch where it had all begun. The fire crackled next to him, just like that first night. But now he was not alone. Around the fire, settlers and natives shared stories, food plans for the future. The future remained uncertain. It would always remain. But Thomas had learned that uncertainty was no excuse for cruelty, that even when tomorrow was doubtful, today it still offered opportunities for goodness, for compassion, for small acts that could echo through the generations. He touched the necklace under his shirt and smiled. His wife would have been proud, not because he had become famous or influential, but because she had remained faithful to the lesson she had worked so hard to teach, that every man carries within him the choice between light and darkness, and that this choice, made day after day, moment after moment, is what truly defines a person's character. The fire continued to burn through the night, its light reaching faces that hatred had kept apart for so long, and in that light, Thomas saw the reflection of something he thought he had lost forever: hope for the future of humanity. If this story of compassion and redemption has touched your soul, you can't miss the next epic journeys that the Wild West still holds for us. Subscribe to the channel and activate the bell so you don't miss any of these narratives that show how humanity can flourish even in the darkest moments of the American frontier.